From Walt Disney Pictures, it's adventure.
We've not a moment to lose.
On July 2nd, 1986, Walt Disney Pictures released The Great Mouse Detective. Loosely based off the Basil of Baker Street books by Eve Titus, The Great Mouse Detective holds an interesting but nevertheless important place in Disney animation history. The idea for the film was conceived in the wake of The Rescuers in 1976, but was put on the back burner so as to not have too many mouse movies in quick succession. However, between its conception and the time The Great Mouse Detective entered pre-production, Disney had been wrought by a few pivotal events. Already feeling directionless and questioning the role of animation in their company with the death of Walt Disney a decade prior, it didn't get easier in 1979 when animator Don Bluth led a huge exodus in the middle of Fox and the Hound's production, taking a lot of the talent with him. There was also the fact that Disney as a company was constantly under threat of hostile takeovers by other corporations. By 1984, Roy E. Disney had ousted then CEO Ron Miller and replaced him with Paramount CEO Michael Eisner in a bid to save the company. Already, Eisner and new film division head Jeffrey Katzenberg began to question whether Disney's role as an animation studio was necessary. At the time, neither of them understood the intricacies of producing animated feature films. Eisner's regime had also come in at Walt Disney Pictures' rock bottom with the release of The Black Cauldron, a $44 million bomb that was outgrossed by, of all things, the Care Bears movie. Luckily, Great Mouse Detective was pitched and greenlit during Black Cauldron as a sort of insurance policy in case that movie bombed like it did. But with Eisner entering the picture, he had little faith in the project, partially because he didn't greenlit it, and partially because he thought the premise wasn't contemporary enough. But since the animation team still got paid whether they made the movie or not, Eisner decided to not waste money and let production continue, albeit with a slashed budget and around 18 months to make it. Despite being a slimmed-down film made quick and cheap, The Great Mouse Detective ended up being a success critically and commercially, while still being outgrossed by rival Don Bluth's An American Tail, which came out later that year. The film did signal to Eisner and Katzenberg that animated features were still viable moneymakers. But the scene that stuck in everyone's mind was the climactic final duel between Basil and the villainous Ratigan. Originally taking place on the hands of Big Ben, layout artist Mike Peraza approached director John Musker with the idea of restaging the fight to take place in Big Ben's Clockwork Innards. This suggestion would lead to one of the earliest computer animated sequences in film. Though creating the 2-minute scene was laborious, with over 54 moving parts created for the scene, the animators were able to pull it off, creating one of the most tense and memorable climaxes in a Disney film up to that point. And while I wouldn't say it was the sole reason why Great Mouse Detective was a success, the climactic scene was influential in proving the practicality of merging traditional and computer animation together, which would ultimately define the Disney Renaissance that was about to emerge in the next couple of years. But Peraza's idea for this scene did not come from nowhere. He had actually been inspired by another animated movie where the climax involved a hero and the young girl he is trying to rescue being chased through the gear-filled interior of a clock tower by an evil villain dressed in black. At the time, this film was only really known in Japan, and barely anyone in America, outside of a few animation professionals and connoisseurs, had even heard of it. But its impact on The Great Mouse Detective proved that this film would become one of the most influential animated films of all time.
Castle of Cagliostro伯爵の城だ。
京都ビデオ。
Gotta admit, choosing the Castle of Cagliostro to be Kyoto Video's first foray into 70s anime was the right, if incredibly obvious, call. Not only is it the directorial debut of immortal animation icon Hayao Miyazaki, not only is it one of the best, if not the best, film entry in the classic Lupin III franchise, but it is also one of the major high points of one of the best years in anime, 1979. 1979 is just one of those incredibly historic years for anime. So many successful and influential anime titles were released that year, and it was the signal that the medium had reached a turning point that would lead to its golden age in the 1980s. Castle of Cagliostro was one of those watershed titles. To give a brief overview, the plot of the film involves Lupin and his partner in crime Jigan investigating the small micronation of Cagliostro for a source of counterfeit money that appeared in their latest heist.
その筋じゃ有名な伝説さ、偽札界のブラックホールっての。
ブラックホール？
ちょっかい出して帰ってきたやつはいないとよ。
As soon as they enter the country, they are immediately involved in a chase between a group of thugs and a runaway girl in a bridal dress named Clarice. After rescuing the girl who is immediately captured again, Lupin finds out that Clarice is to be wed to the sovereign ruler of the country, Count Cagliostro. Lupin then decides that this will be his next heist, stealing Clarice away from the clutches of the villainous Count.
色と欲の伯爵殿、花嫁はいただきます。近日参上、ルパン三世。
But as Lupin assembles his perfect heist, some questions will be raised. What is the extent of the Count's counterfeiting operation? Why does the Count want to possess the mysterious ring that Clarice has? And is this really the first meeting between Lupin and Clarice?
はてな、どっかで。
Now, in terms of mainstream popularity, Castle of Cagliostro's relevance in popular otakudom is very hard to pin down. It's not obscure by any stretch of the imagination, being both Miyazaki's debut and an entry in the long-running Lupin franchise all but cements a massive legacy, but at the same time, Castle of Cagliostro honestly feels like it takes a backseat to Miyazaki's other bigger films. This could be because there is a subset of anime fans who rarely venture into anything that came out before My Neighbor Totoro, and some blame can also be laid to the fact that because it's attached to a huge decade-spanning franchise like Lupin, people can feel intimidated from going in without any prior knowledge of the series. But regardless, Castle of Cagliostro does appear to be getting more well known by the day. I mean, when all is said and done, Cagliostro is still Miyazaki's first film, and people are going to watch and recommend it to others for its place in history alone. But what if Castle of Cagliostro's historical importance goes beyond just being Miyazaki's first film? What if it is one of the most influential anime films, hell, one of the most influential films of all time? But in order to adequately explain why that is, we need to lay down some history. The character of Arsène Lupin debuted in the short story The Arrest of Arsène Lupin in the pages of Je sais tout magazine in 1905. The creation of French author Maurice Leblanc, Lupin was the character archetype for what we now know as the gentleman thief, a well-off scion born into wealth with impeccable manners and roguish charm, resorting to theft as a means to stave off the boredom of being the idle rich. But Lupin is portrayed as an unambiguous force of good who just so happens to be operating on the wrong side of the law. His targets are often far more villainous than he ever will be, and his main motivation to steal comes from how little his targets appreciate their treasures, most stories ending with him redistributing his stolen riches to the masses. The Lupin stories were very popular in Europe, to the point where he even had a story of him outwitting a legally distinct version of Sherlock Holmes. But one unexpected place where the stories found popularity was the island nation of Japan. Almost 60 years after the first Arsène Lupin story was published, manga author Kazuhiko Kato, having been inspired by those stories, decided to pen a story about the gentleman thief's Japanese grandson. He would be just like his grandfather, cunning, charming, charismatic, and stealing from those far more criminal than he ever could be. The only difference being that this gentleman thief was decidedly very ungentlemanly. With that, the Lupin III manga debuted on August 10th, 1967, and Kato would begin to start going by the pen name he chose when he wrote the first chapter, Monkey Punch. Between the original run of Lupin III between 1967 to 69, Monkey Punch created one of the most memorable cast of main characters in manga history. The titular Lupin, the constantly scheming thief whose carefree attitude allowed him to catch opponents off guard, but is still nevertheless a slave to his vices. Daisuke Jigan, an expert marksman and Lupin's best friend, whose gruff and more pragmatic attitude makes him a necessary foil to the more relaxed Lupin. Fujiko Mine, a femme fatale with proclaimed breasts the size of Mount Fuji, who acts as both a rival and ally to Lupin, but will more often than not betray him at the last seconds. Goemon Ishikawa XIII, Lupin's stoic enemy turned ally whose expert swordsmanship is only matched by his outdated beliefs and fashion sense. And finally, Inspector Zenigata, a persistent Interpol chief who's made it his mission in life to see Lupin in cuffs. However, while Monkey Punch might have created these characters and their general personalities, they wouldn't become the pop cultural juggernauts they are known today if it weren't for the efforts of this man and his two pupils. I'm just going to go out on a limb here and say that Yasuo Otsuka might be the most important animator in the history of anime. A former law enforcement officer, Otsuka came up at a time in post-war Japan where there was no real professional school for animation. He mostly honed his skills just by doodling constantly, including hand-copying Preston Blair's famous book on animation just as a way to better teach himself. By 1956, Otsuka was able to get hired by the only true big Japanese animation studio at the time, Toei Doga, later to be known as Toei Animation. There, he instantly rose through the ranks with his ability to draw and animate some of the most technically complex scenes ever seen in Japanese animation at the time. Around 1959, Otsuka would meet a young assistant director by the name of Isao Takahata, who, while not a talented animator like Otsuka, was an excellent storyteller and director. Otsuka clearly saw potential in him and immediately took him under his wing to help him better understand animation and how he could use it to tell his stories. By 1963, Otsuka had become Toei's top animator, and while he was working on Toei's first series Wolf Boy Kin, he met another future pupil of his, a young in-betweener by the name of Hayao Miyazaki. Otsuka also took him aboard as an apprentice, mentoring him in how he can make his animation better. He also introduced him to Takahata, and the two of them would soon become both the best of friends and the fiercest of rivals. Throughout the 60s, Otsuka continued to mentor his two kohais, ultimately leading to him pushing Takahata to take up the director's mantle and make his feature-length debut with 1968's Horus, Prince of the Sun, with Otsuka as animation director and Miyazaki having tons of story input as a concept artist and key animator. The film, while good, was also incredibly ambitious and very expensive. So when it underperformed at the Japanese box office, Takahata was immediately demoted and the three of them soon found themselves looking for an exit strategy. After finishing up work on Toei's iconic Puss in Boots film, Otsuka left Toei in 1969 to join a brand new animation studio that had sprung up, Tokyo Movie Shinsha. He would find himself working at A Production, an internal studio at Tokyo Movie established by former Toei animators. Around that same time, TMS founder Yutaka Fujioka was shown the manga for a series called Lupin III. He loved it instantly and decided that TMS would be totally on board to make an anime adaptation. However, since TMS was still a relatively small studio compared to the much larger Toei, they could only afford to make a 10-minute pitch pilot filmed in CinemaScope. This would be Otsuka's first project at the new studio. While the animation of the pilot was remarkably high quality for its time thanks to Otsuka, few financial backers were biting. Many were concerned about the level of sex and violence that could be on display because, believe it or not, there was a time where anime was thought of as just being for kids, even in its country of origin. By 1971, TMS gave up completely on making a Lupin film and decided to rework it into a television series, which allowed them to gain financial backing from Yomiuri TV. Ordered for 26 episodes, when Lupin finally made it to air that same year, it was a ratings bomb. Masaki Osumi, who directed the original pilot film and was attached to the TV project, received numerous executive notes after 7 episodes aired, demanding that he make the show more kid-friendly. Osumi refused and was immediately fired mid-production. The Lupin story would have ended here had Otsuka's pupils, Takahata and Miyazaki, not followed him to A-Pro around that same time. They had been trying to start production on a Pippi Longstocking adaptation that was currently going nowhere. Otsuka, figuring that his two guys had nothing else better to do, vouched for them and was able to bring them both aboard as the two directors of Lupin. From episode 9 onward, Takahata and Miyazaki would make sweeping changes that would help define the Lupin franchise from that point onward. One of the big changes was removing any sense of what the two of them considered apathy in the series. Lupin and the gang did not steal because they are bored, but because they enjoyed the challenge and want to see if they can get away with it. This is reflected in a personality change for Lupin, making him the more positive and upbeat doofus we know him today.
どこも車一台に大元すぎるがね。ピストル一丁で十分やれるぜ。
ルパン流にやらせてもらうさ。
This philosophy is also reflected in how they changed Lupin's background. While in the manga he was an idle-rich philanderer, Miyazaki and Takahata, both of whom were huge Marxists at the time, decided to change Lupin and the rest of the main cast into more common people, sharply dressed vagabonds as it were. This change is best shown off by trading manga Lupin's ostentatious Mercedes-Benz SSK to his now trademark yellow 1957 Fiat 500, the same car Otsuka himself drove. Sadly, none of the changes were able to save the anime from getting cancelled after 23 episodes. However, it would later find new life through reruns, and it would become so popular that a second series was commissioned in 1977 that would run far longer and would spawn the first Lupin film, Mystery of Mamo, which I may also get into one of these days. Between the first and second series, Takahata and Miyazaki left TMS to go work for Zuyo Enterprises on an anime called Heidi Girl of the Alps. The show was a monster hit and helped make Miyazaki a household name. Shortly afterwards, Zuyo would split into two groups, with one of them being Nippon Animation, where Takahata and Miyazaki would work on their World Masterpiece Theater franchise. By the late 70s, Miyazaki was assisting Takahata on his adaptation of Anne of Green Gables, but Miyazaki was growing creatively restless. He had gotten a taste of doing solo directing work with Future Boy Conan, and he wanted to keep doing that out from under Takahata's shadow. Luckily for him, he got a call from his friend and mentor Otsuka. Otsuka had gone back to TMS after working with Miyazaki on Conan to head up a new internal studio called Telecom. They had made Mystery of Mamo, which was such a huge success that another Lupin film was immediately commissioned. Otsuka, who was currently being threatened with a directorial position on the next film that he did not want, offered Miyazaki the vacant position to make the film. Miyazaki quit Anne of Green Gables and Nippon Animation that very afternoon and didn't look back. With Otsuka backing up and a team of hand-picked professionals, Miyazaki got to work on the next Lupin film titled The Castle of Cagliostro. And they had to start work quick because Miyazaki's team only had 8 months to finish it. Production began in May of 1979, principal animation started in July, and production finally wrapped at the end of November, just in time for the film's December premiere. So how did it all turn out? One thing I can say about Castle of Cagliostro is that it is definitely an animation fan's anime. Not only did this film prove to be a showcase for Miyazaki's skills as both a director and writer, but also as a means to flex the skills he honed as both a storyboarder and a designer. Take the setting, for example. The first thing Miyazaki did when producing this film was draw a bird's eye view of the setting before even writing a single word of the plot. A Europhile if there ever was one, Miyazaki drew multiple sources ranging from a book about Italian mountain cities to some of his old sketches he made while working on Heidi. The story itself would be inspired by an Arsène Lupin book not written by Leblanc called La Justice de Arsène Lupin, in which the titular thief discovers a hoard of counterfeit bills that Germany had planned to use to destabilize the French economy during the Great War. But Miyazaki's biggest inspiration came from one of his favorite animated films, The Shepherdess and the Chimney Sweep, an unfinished 1952 French film that involves two young lovers trying to escape from a pompous noble's castle which is full of traps. With these influences, Miyazaki was able to craft a setting that felt fantastical yet lived in and realistic. Verdant green hills, dark skeleton-filled dungeons, ornate bedrooms that perfectly symbolize a gilded cage for Clarice. Look at this shot where we see the titular castle for the first time. So much thought was put into how this castle and its surroundings work. You get a great sense of scale by how big it is compared to the village on its left, and the sheer contrast between it and Lupin and Jigan. And then there's the clock tower, the biggest and closest part of the castle in the shot, how it instantly draws your eye to show you its importance, how its rough facade indicates its age, how it prominently displays a staircase and entrance on its outside to show how people can get in and around it. Just one of the many examples to show how much thought Miyazaki and his staff put into Cagliostro's setting, and it gets even better when you see the world in motion. Both Otsuka and Miyazaki had an eye for skilled animators because this entire film is where they all get to shine. Not only do you get to see the detailed complexity that Otsuka excels at, but you also get to see the talent of people such as Tsukasa Tanai, a young animator whose fluid animation allowed for some of the most smoothest scenes, such as the famous scene where Lupin tries in vain to swim up a waterfall. Atsuko Tanaka, one of Miyazaki's most gifted pupils and a female animator that truly excelled in a then male-dominated industry. Her character animation is the glue that holds a lot of the scenes together, such as my personal favorite scene where Lupin is sneaking outside the castle rooftops. Kazuhida Tomonga, a TMS lifer who did a lot of the big climactic action scenes, like the famous chase scene at the beginning and the duel in the clock tower at the end, all of which are animated to get the most out of all the action. And all of these talents were united under Otsuka's animation direction. Otsuka was one of the first progenitors of adding realism to anime, and not just in a way of drawing detailed car engines. Otsuka believed in what he referred to as constructed realism, a brand of realism that isn't trying to be as real as possible, but is more about convincing the audience that what they are seeing is real. He does this by adding these little details to how characters move or react to their surroundings, like how when the chase scene in the beginning is about to start, you have a shot of Lupin firing up the Fiat's engine, but in the corner of your eye you can see Jigan hurriedly trying to finish changing the tire by kicking it into place. Or how in the chase scene when Lupin and Jigan cut through the forest, you get a few frames of Lupin getting painfully conked in the face by a branch. These little details almost didn't need to be there, but because they are there, they make all the characters seem more human, and in turn make the action more thrilling and the story more compelling. With how well the animation and art serve the film to make it such a thrilling, exciting adventure, it's really no wonder that this film premiered to mixed reception. While the film was a modest box office success, reception to The Castle of Cagliostro was quite divisive, especially amongst Lupin fans. Quite a few people took the film to task with what they saw as a toned-down Lupin anime. For one thing, this is one of the least violent entries in the Lupin library. On a scale of 1 to Goemon's blood spray, it's a 2 bordering on 3. Despite the film being lousy with ninja goons, Lupin and the gang barely rack up a body count. More people die by misadventure than they do at the hands of Lupin's gang in this film, and if they do end up killing some goons, it's always off screen. Compare this to the last film where you can see Goemon do this.
Goemon! Huh? What the hell?
Hell, Lupin doesn't kill anyone over the course of the film, and when he actually gets the chance, he instantly loses his gun. But what really was the sticking point for some people was the fact that the 5 main characters of the Lupin franchise were out of character. Miyazaki did file down some of the less than savory aspects of the original manga to fit his vision for TV, but no one seemed to take issue with it at the time. But because he's taking his interpretation of Lupin III to an 11 in this movie, now people are gonna start to mutter, "It's not my Lupin." Well, not everyone has changed here. Goemon stays relatively consistent with his character as a super serious living anachronism, although that could be because out of the main 5, he has the least screen time. The same can be said for Jigan more or less, as he's still Lupin's prickly foil.
どったの？
とぼけるんじゃないの。一人でカッコつけて悩むんじゃねえ。ほら、言え。
Although his role in this film is less skilled marksman and more second banana that Lupin can bounce exposition off of.
おいルパン、この古城に何かあるのか？ゴート文字。聞かねえなだな。カリオストロ広告だ。光と影、再び一つとなりて蘇らんか。
But then you get to Zenigata and the changes start to become more apparent. In material prior, he was more in line with his manga counterparts, portraying what Monkey Punch called Tom to Lupin's Jerry, a bumbling antagonist who is always outsmarted by his target. Quick! But here, he's actually a competent investigator, and the dance between him and Lupin definitely feels more like a battle of wits.
あの風車は何だ？グスタフ殿の話では城内へ水をあげているとのことです。その水の出口は上の砲台の潜水です。次、はっ！
Cagliostro also really showcased a lot of Zenigata's nobler side, that he's a man devoted to upholding the law and justice, and it really does showcase the tragedy of Zenigata in that he's a man who works for a corrupt system that doesn't share his zeal for upholding the law.
その通り。現に大量の偽ドルが某国によって発注された証拠が。 このリセリーブルこそ CIA の発注じゃないのかね。やめたまえ。ここに国家間の争いを持ち込んでもらっては困る。
But the character that I think drew the most ire for how Miyazaki interpreted them was Fujiko. Miyazaki always had a distaste for Fujiko's use as what he deemed cheap erotica, and he is a major reason as to why Fujiko is remembered more as one of anime's great female anti-heroes and less as just eye candy. While she's still the same scheming Fujiko, it almost feels like Miyazaki was trolling her legion of horny fanboys and how he used her. She spends the first half of the film in a conservative schoolmarm dress, and the latter half in a military jumpsuit that's more realistically fitting than any other clothes in Fujiko's wardrobe. For comparison, Fujiko's first scene in Mystery of Mamo is her sleeping in the nude, while in Cagliostro we don't even get a good glimpse of Fujiko's. And then we have Lupin himself. Now, Lupin is still recognizably Lupin. Happy-go-lucky attitude, crafty as a fox, and a bit of a doofus, though not by the standards of previous entries. But for Castle of Cagliostro, Miyazaki turns one of anime's famous anti-heroes into a full-blown hero. A noble, empathetic hero. And while this isn't entirely unexpected, Miyazaki's Green Jacket Lupin is accepted as one of the softest interpretations of the character. The interpretation can be jarring for some Lupin fans. For example, instead of getting all handy with Clarice like he would with any woman standing arm's length to him, he does this.
どうかこの泥棒めに盗まれてやってください。
私を
金庫に閉じ込められた宝石たちを救い出し、無理やり花嫁にされようとしている女の子は緑の野に放してあげる。これみんな泥棒の仕事なんです。
But there's a point to all of this. More than halfway through the movie, we get a flashback to when Lupin tried and failed to pull a heist on the Count's castle, and that's how he ended up meeting Clarice as a young girl. And the version we see of Lupin is more in line with the original manga, this cocky, lecherous, hotshot scoundrel who shoots expensive guns and speeds around in a Benz.
俺は一人で売り出そうと躍起になっている青二歳だった。
The reason why Lupin is more heroic in this film is because the Lupin we see is an older, wiser Lupin, a Lupin that has been around the block a couple of times, has grown up, and knows that he's not invincible. It's an interpretation that Miyazaki wanted to do because this film is meant to be a send-off to his version of Lupin, his final say on the character, if you ignore the fact that he directed 2 episodes of Red Jacket Lupin shortly afterwards. And while the movie does end on a "and so the adventure continues" note, it definitely feels like a grand finale. You have Lupin and Zenigata teaming up to take down a larger threat. You have Lupin almost dying. It's the kind of anime that definitely has an extra layer to it if you're a fan of Lupin and have a general knowledge of the series and its cast. How it caught on amongst American animators who had never seen Lupin before is anyone's guess. The early 80s was a time where TMS was really looking to break into the Western markets, and they thought the best way to do that was through Castle of Cagliostro, even though that film, by the staff's own admission, wasn't made for a global audience in mind. One of their first attempts was sending a subtitled 35mm print to Fred Patton and Mark Merlino of the Cartoon Fantasy Organization, the first and only American anime club at the time, and see if they could organize screenings at local sci-fi cons to drum up interest. While the screenings ultimately failed due to nerds looking down on animation as inferior to serious mature science fiction stories like Star Wars, it did attract interest from the burgeoning community of animation students at CalArts. Even though Castle of Cagliostro wouldn't come out in any official capacity until 1993, this early subtitle print really got around the California area and inspired the next generation of animators. Not only would it inspire future animators of Disney, but also future animators of Warner Brothers who would go on to work in tandem with TMS. TMS even sent the print to a couple of film festivals which would catch the eye of a few Hollywood personnel, one of them rumored to be Steven Spielberg. This is an endless source of speculation, and it might not even be true, but watch the chase scenes from Cagliostro and Raiders of the Lost Ark back to back and draw your own conclusions. The point being that the reason why Castle of Cagliostro influenced creatives the world over was because it helped raise the bar for animation. At a time where most animation was done cheap and quick, here comes an animated feature that almost seems completely indiscernible from the average Hollywood adventure film. It was groundbreaking, and it showed animators and filmmakers the world over just how far film can go in delivering lavish, large-scale features that can thrill everyone. In short, the Castle of Cagliostro could be seen as the first bell signaling the animation renaissance that would slowly begin to blossom in the mid-80s. But if you want more solid evidence on how Castle of Cagliostro influenced others, look no further than the director himself. It's quite easy to see why Castle of Cagliostro would be the terminus a quo for what would be the typical Miyazaki film. Sure, you have easy connections like the flourishing hilly backdrops, the flying machines, and well-animated set pieces involving food, but then you have the character of Clarice. While it is easy to write her off as a victimized damsel, she definitely has the makings of a proto-Miyazaki female protagonist. She's kind, nurturing, but also has a hidden defiant streak. She's introduced to us escaping from the Count's goons in a speeding car. Even if she does end up ultimately resigned to her fate, it's clear that she didn't get there easily. Plus, there's also the fact that her Japanese voice actress, Sumi Shimamoto, would later voice Nausicaa, the Miyazaki female protagonist. Why bring all this up? Well, because Castle of Cagliostro is Miyazaki finally working on a project with the amount of freedom he had long desired while working under Takahata. He is currently finding what resonates with him as a creative, what he likes to see be put on screen. This is not just a directorial debut, but also a journey of self-discovery. And how appropriate it is that Miyazaki made this journey on the franchise that made him what he is today. This is another reason why Miyazaki wanted Castle of Cagliostro to be his final say on his interpretation of Lupin. He knew in his heart that he would be working on bigger projects, and if he wanted to move forward, he would have to leave work on anime like Lupin behind. So Castle of Cagliostro is a transition. It's Miyazaki closing a chapter of his life where he was mostly defined by how he portrayed a master thief with a devil-may-care attitude, and opening a new chapter where he would define himself with stories about brave princesses, forest spirits, and castles in the sky. This is best symbolized by the ending, where, as much as it pains him, Lupin has to leave Clarice behind to forge her own future, while he gets to go on more of the same adventures. Lupin and friends head off to a certain future full of thievery, while Clarice, who here is the seed by which Miyazaki will find his own identity as a director, stays behind to walk a different path. The Castle of Cagliostro is more than just Miyazaki's first film. It's a film that represents the future of animation at the time, the sign of a massive sea change that was about to sweep the 1980s, not just in anime, but all of animation in general. It showed the world a better class of animated feature, inspired a small generation of creatives to replicate it, and even helped define the identity of one of the most recognizable and influential directors in the world. The bells rang, the sun rose, and the Castle of Cagliostro was there at the tail end of 1979 to announce that a new era of animation was on the horizon.